More fallout from the Robert Sarver investigation by the NBA after the ESPN report. Katie Heindl of Dime magazine and the Basketball Feelings newsletter joins me to break it all down, coming up on Locked On Suns.
You are Locked On Suns, your daily Phoenix Suns podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
We are back. This is Locked On Phoenix Suns. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Brendon Kleen, covering the Suns the past 5 seasons as a credentialed media member. Thank you for making Locked On Suns your first listen every single morning. Plenty to come here as this Robert Sarver story continues to unfold. More statements, more media comments, more to dissect. Joining me to do that is Katie Heindl. She is a writer at Dime, and she is the writer of the Basketball Feelings newsletter. Katie, let's just get right into it today. There's not really a great way to set the stage, but what I wanted to start out with here is just there are so many anecdotes in this Baxter Holmes story that people are still sifting through. And as we were just going through before we hit record, so many different people speaking up about this. What's sticking with you? What's on your mind relating to this Robert Sarver story?
I think what's sticking with me and what you and I kind of touched on before we started recording. Well, first, thanks for having me. And it's the way that we're going to now see fallout from different camps in terms of who makes a statement and when, and the strength and power, if there is any strength and power behind those statements now as they come out. I think certain people will watch to see who makes statements before they feel perhaps emboldened enough to make their own statements, which in itself is very telling, I think. So, I want to touch on something you mentioned in your podcast yesterday, which was, is it likely to expect that Sarver won't be present or won't kind of make a statement, or the players, like Suns players won't make a statement about this until June, and like what that kind of is about the team. But I feel like men in Sarver's position of power, and especially men that are used to the kind of spotlight and notoriety that he has, have a real hard time like keeping quiet and like sticking to backstage. So I expect that you'll probably hear something sooner than later.
Yeah, it's obviously interesting for sort of the drama of everything, right? Does this person make things worse for himself? Does he try to protect himself? But it's also, if you're, again, sort of taking seriously and thinking seriously about what's being alleged in the piece, it's bringing a person accused of creating a toxic workplace back into that workplace, right? And you start to get very quickly into this idea of when an investigation is playing out and the person who's being investigated is the absolute most powerful person in the situation, what can be done? And I heard, I think people should definitely listen to Baxter Holmes with Zach Lowe on his podcast if you haven't, because they spend about 45 minutes really going sort of case by case through a lot of these things and what the fallout in terms of their reporting in the days since the publication of the piece has been. And they both agreed that the general consensus is that, similar to the Donald Sterling situation and others across sports, what really is going to push this forward, I would say the NWSL situation too. Maybe people aren't quite as familiar, but that is something that played out very similarly in terms of the players pushing this forward. And to the thing you were saying that I was kind of wondering aloud about in the podcast the other day, it's they both Book and CP have now said they're going to wait for the investigation to play out. Monty Williams said the same thing. Well, we don't know when that's going to happen. So I do want to kind of talk about that gray area, that zone that we're in right now, Katie, because you wrote a little bit about this in your newsletter this week, talking about Steve Kerr. And I guess in some ways, I want to be careful to not just have this be an attack on Kerr specifically, because I do think we've also seen Whether it's locally, we have Larry Fitzgerald, who's a minority owner of this team, an NFL star, probably the most famous single sports figure in the Valley, talking about this as part of a statement and supporting Robert Sarver and kind of condemning the report in a way. We also have Steve Nash, who was around, who was asked about this. He's now the Brooklyn Nets coach, and he gave a very simple answer, but said, no, I did not see, and I have no reason to believe that these things happened. So it's not just Kerr, but it's these folks who kind of go out on a limb to stand up for somebody who's being accused of pretty disgusting things. What does it make you think? How does it fall into a pattern? And where do these comments come from? Why do these people stand up so proudly in these moments, do you think?
Yeah, it's funny because we don't have to make it all about Kerr because it's more of an archetype. And I think that's what I was trying to touch on mostly is that, Kerr specifically, because Kerr has done this before with Luke Walton specifically and the sexual assault allegations that were leveled against Walton. And now it's in a similar vein and similar tone to the Sarver allegations. Granted, there are 70 people making these allegations collectively, and Walton's was one, and it was Walton's word against his accuser, basically.
And I believe they settled, right? Just to clarify,
they did settle, which, also to further clarify, doesn't mean is what people really hold that up, I think, in terms of like justice was served. It's black and white. It's not, and it isn't. And I think these kinds of investigations just further show that, and perhaps how ill-equipped collectively we are in looking at these things. Collectively, the NBA is in looking at these things, but to the Steve Kerr point specifically, to men like Steve Nash, to men that are in positions where they are asked to comment on pretty nefarious things, people in positions of power that they know or once worked with or are close with, are being accused of, and then when they come back and say, I disagree with this, but only based on the character value that I've assigned this other person. I think it's pretty insulting to all the other people that are making the accusations, because it's basically just one guy's word against his friend. And of course he's going to vouch for his friend. And it's also, I think, pretty easily refuted, because in most cases, the examples that someone like Kerr or Nash will give is that, quote, I've never seen them behave this way. But not to be glib, no shit, you haven't, because none of, especially with Sarver, where these are kind of, his stuff seems to be a real manipulation of power and holding that power over people and making people as uncomfortable as possible, to remind them that he's in a position of power at all times and he will wield that. He would not behave that way towards someone like Steve Kerr, especially Steve Kerr, in terms of he's who brought Sarver into the franchise in the first place. So there are certain roads of power you have to trace, I think, when you examine statements like the one Kerr made. And I also want to quibble a little bit with what you said of them going out on a limb, because actually I think, if anything, they're in an extremely comfortable position. I don't think they're actually ever putting themselves out on a limb, because when Kerr, and this is what I wrote about, when Kerr or Nash, I even think of like Neil O'Shea with the Chauncey Billups accusations this past summer, when they make these kinds of statements and say, I don't recognize the person who's being accused of this, they're kind of removing themselves first from actually agreeing or disagreeing. And they're also excusing themselves from anything ever reflecting, I think, poorly or badly back on them, because they're not saying, yeah, my friend did a shitty thing, or because they're not really aligning themselves whatsoever. It's extremely slippery language. And I think it allows them to stay in this really comfortable, somewhat padded position of power, where they, as long as they, I guess it's because as long as they get to exist there, they don't really want to make that difficult for themselves or the men who kind of, and I keep saying men because typically, especially within the NBA, it's just white billionaire male owners kind of exist and are aligned within that power structure with them. So again, it's like whatever they can do to kind of not rock the boat, say the least, basically, without endangering themselves or the people in most cases that they're talking about. So again, I use Kerr as an example because to me personally, he is a really frustrating example because he has been extremely progressive about other things and extremely willing to speak on, issues of social justice, gender politics, sometimes weirdly considering like the Luke Walton stuff that we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
But when it comes to these kinds of really concrete accusations, he's kind of like, I don't know. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's very vague, right? And that's what's
Yeah.
frustrating to me because Steve Kerr in situations like this can be so direct, right?
Mm-hmm.
And hasn't been shy
Yeah.
about that before. But these are situations where he suddenly kind of becomes a little bit uncharacteristically mute.
Mm-hmm. No, and to echo what you're saying, I mean, I would kind of encourage people to look at of the stories where we know the status within the organization of the person that was the victim of what's being alleged. It's Earl Watson, a first-time head coach in his early 30s, a Black Hispanic man trying to make his way. It's Taylor Griffin, the 15th man on the roster. It's a 25-year-old. I don't know what his role was, but the staffer who Robert Sarver pantsed in public. It's
Mm-hmm.
these people at the very bottom of the totem pole who were, like you said, a victim of a sort of power grab moment that Sarver is. Whether it's we don't even need to talk about the intention of it, but that's the target of a lot of these things. And for them to be able to feel comfortable going on the record is a testament to the amount that it affected them and the sort of bravery that they have. Compare that to the level and the relative risk of somebody like Steve Kerr going out and saying what he actually believes. I don't know what he actually believes, but saying something more truthful, something more evocative than what he did, which is to kind of act as if he has no clue.
Mm-hmm.
That would be very little risk for Steve Kerr. He's not going to get fired by the Golden State Warriors if he says, I saw some troubling things. I wish I would have spoken up. I didn't know for sure what the right thing to do was, and I hope the NBA investigation can play out. I mean, that's still not necessarily aggressive, but it's at least probably closer to what I would imagine the truth to be based on what people like Amin El-Hassan, Raja Bell, some of these people who have spoken publicly because they're in media now, have said, which is that these things are not surprising. We saw very similar things. We may not have seen something that got to the point of needing to be reported or talked about to somebody, but it's not a surprise to us. Whereas you compare that to what Kerr or Nash are saying, where it's like, well, how are the people in the same exact building having such a different memory of the time that they spent there? And maybe it's the fact that Amin and Raja are Black men and that Steve are not. I don't know, but I guess you're, just to echo what you're saying, looking closer at who is speaking, what they have to lose by speaking, and what they say is honestly what we're left with, I think, in many ways at this point. So let's make our way through this a little bit more. I do want to kind of talk about the players and the way that this is going to loom and maybe some other ways that this fits into a broader discussion, Katie. But first, I want to tell our listeners about Prize Picks. It's the perfect daily fantasy app. It's made easy for everybody, and it's perfect for any daily NBA fanatic. We love it here at the Locked On Podcast Network because it makes things simple. You don't play against a pool. You don't play against an opponent. You pick 2 to 5 players, you bet against the spread, and you win, hopefully. That is the deal. So they have picks for everything from points and rebounds to maybe some more sophisticated stuff like total points, rebounds, and assists or whatever. You got to sift through Prize Picks, see what they have, but that is what you're betting against. Let's say you go Kawhi, well, maybe not right now. Book over 20.5 points that night. If he gets 21 points, you win that matchup. That is how it works. It's not, it's not head to head. It's not day-to-day stuff. It is one time only, and it is simple. So use the award-winning Prize Picks app on both the App Store and the Google Play Store. Entries can be made in 60 seconds or less, and Prize Picks is proud of their safe and fast withdrawal. So don't hesitate. Check out prizepicks.com or that mobile app. Use the promo code NBA and enjoy. Prize Picks Daily Fantasy made easy. Today's show is also brought to you by DirecTV Stream. Does this sound familiar? You've got one device that lets you catch the game live, another that lets you stream your favorite shows. You're watching sports highlights on your phone, and you've got your neighbor's best friend's login just for the good stuff. Well, I want to tell you about a simple way to get all the entertainment that you love without the hassle, and a great way to finally get your TV together. It's called DirecTV Stream, and it brings your live TV and on-demand favorites together like never before, so you can watch your favorite sports, movies, and shows all in one place. That means no more juggling remotes and no need to buy another device ever again. And the best part is there is no annual contract. So get rid of the clutter and the confusion and get your TV together with DirecTV Stream. You can learn more at directtv.com. That's directtv.com. Compatible device required. Content varies by package. Okay, Katie, so let's pick up back here on the point we were kind of initially on about the players. And it actually reminded me of something you and I were talking about in the playoffs. I don't know if you remember, we were talking about Chris Paul, like you wrote about after the Suns lost the finals, how much he's just lived in his career. Injuries, losing, aging, and now worrying about, well, what will my legacy be? Will I get over that hump and finally win? Not to mention the numerous situations he's faced off the court, whether it was the ESPYs moment with him and LeBron and those guys, or the Donald Sterling situation, being president of the NBPA during a bubble and a mass global protest against racism and all of these things. And I think that is why people were so curious to see what Chris said on Thursday night. And it's not a game I was planning to come in person. I obviously made my way down there because I was curious as well. And he chose to play things very close to the vest. So I wonder what you made of Chris. I don't know if you saw specific comments, but there wasn't really much said. He said, I'm going to wait things out here. What did you make of that? And not to put, again, pressure on him to be the one to sort of save this moment, but he's somebody people are going to continue to look to.
Yeah, and I think this is one of those moments where I don't necessarily think it is at all relevant what Chris Paul, what Booker, Monty Williams more so, just because he does straddle that line between, he's part of the front office, he's on the team side as well, right? Like in terms of like basketball ops and the kind of like higher echelon that all of this is trickling down from. I think we want to hear from players because sometimes they seem like the direct reaction and like the direct line of contact that we as media or even we as fans have. In this situation, I'm more curious to hear what someone like Chris Paul would think personally, just given, as you mentioned, all the positions of leadership that he's been in. He's been through this, he's been through this once before. He was head up of the NBPA. So I think just in terms of the way that he is now kind of used to being in that position, and also like being the speaker, right, on behalf of a lot of people, I think he does kind of handle that weight a little bit more naturally than some other players. But it doesn't surprise me that he said he would wait. It doesn't surprise me. I mean, Booker just kind of came out in favor. Who did Booker, like, I'm forgetting now. I can't believe I'm blanking.
He spoke up on behalf of Earl Watson.
Right,
When
on behalf
Tim
of Earl
McMahon
Watson.
of ESPN asked him, do you think he's credible? Because all the statements from the team have said Earl is not a credible source for the story, and Book said he is.
Yeah, and to me that's more worthwhile, right? Like, like that's something that if Booker feels comfortable speaking about that, and like supporting someone who's made a difficult allegation and isn't necessarily in a position to gain much from it now. And as you mentioned before, has made this allegation because it probably represented a lot of psychic kind of pain and strife, like over the years, that it got to the point where he just didn't feel like he could sit on it anymore. Then that's totally one thing. But I don't think in this it necessarily is going to really impact what happened, because again, like Sarver's not. There were allegations in that story of Sarver going after players, but it would never be a player like Booker or Chris Paul. They are simply like, they wield too much power and autonomy. Even Booker, like in a relatively like younger career compared to Chris Paul. So they're not. I think Sarver knows that, right? Like I think Sarver knows not to make them uncomfortable. He's also existing in a completely different era of player autonomy with these two players than some of the players that were making allegations against him in the past, right? I'm more curious to hear what Monty would say, again, because I think he had to have known, like just like back channels and kind of he's in the locker room. He's probably like heard some of these things before. These are really insular, small spaces, which like you and I know, just like being around a team, you get to understand how small of an ecosystem it is, right? And people
Mhm.
talk and things get out and
And even the NBA, right? I mean,
yeah,
Monty's been in the NBA for his whole
exactly.
life, and if these things
Exactly.
were in the grapevine, then you would think he would have heard about it, whether he knew if
Mhm.
it was true or not. The rumor would have been there, yeah.
Mhm. I'm always a little bit careful too, especially like because in this story, like you want to hear from a coach like Monty Williams because of his character and like as you mentioned, like how he's like been around the NBA, so he could perhaps offer a counterpoint to like what a coach like Steve Kerr is saying. But also at the same time, when a lot of these allegations are being leveled by Black people against the way that Sarver treated them, I don't necessarily think that that's a fair weight to put on Monty, you know what I mean? To like speak on
Mhm.
behalf of like what that kind of means to him. Because also I think there's such a thing as, people need time to process news like this. And I
Yeah,
think, perhaps Monty's just thinking of like, well, what's the future like ownership situation of this organization? Not that his job is in
yeah.
jeopardy, but like that stuff is all going to be pretty impactful on what he's
Mhm.
doing. It also doesn't surprise me because, I think he probably wants the team to focus on playing basketball as much as they
Yeah.
possibly can right now. So
Mhm.
I think all of that stuff factors into what we have or haven't really heard from those guys.
Yeah, they know their words carry weight. I mean, what I was just saying about the reporting that, seems to be coalescing around everybody's on their edge of their seats to see what these guys say. They know that, and they
Hmm.
know that saying something out of turn or without all of the facts or knowledge or even like you said, the time to just clarify their perspective on this,
Hmm.
it could really carry a lot of weight. And if all of a sudden Chris were to say something incredibly damning or say, I think this outcome should happen, things move very quickly forward from there, right? And
Hmm.
so I don't think I was surprised per se either. And especially, just because it's been compared so often to the Sterling situation and the throwing of the practice jerseys into the center of the court. And they were saying that, they've said since that they were potentially going to not play that playoff game and they
Hmm.
decided to do so. That all was happening in the background, right? We know it now because it's been several years and there's been documentaries and podcast series and tons of stories told about it, and half the people are in the media now that were part of that situation. But we didn't know it at the time in the same way. So I guess I would say these things maybe are for sure being talked about behind closed doors, and potentially, these things are being clarified and put into maybe action or more clear stances and voices than they have been. It is very, very early on. Let's keep this thread though, because I kind of want to hear from you about where maybe in a vacuum this should go
Hmm.
versus where it is going. And I just can't get my head away from the way in which the team is trying to use this sort of, it's part of a narrative, a false narrative idea. I can't get that out of my head because I think it's just very
It's stupid.
it's stupid. Sure, it's
Yeah.
stupid. It's stupid. So let's let's get there after a quick break. First, though, a word from Built Bar, the best tasting protein bar on the planet. Built Bar is celebrating Thanksgiving this year, guys. We all love Thanksgiving here. Good food treats, but maybe you don't want to partake in the dessert, and maybe you don't want to partake in like what cranberry sauce or sweet potato. Some of these things that are packed with sugar, maybe not the best for you. Maybe you're more of a lean turkey and green beans, and then maybe a Built Bar. Or maybe the Built Bar can be what you get through the days where you're not splurging with during the holidays. We don't like to get out of control and maybe gain some weight. Maybe you're fine with gaining weight. I don't know. But Built Bar is there to fill in the gaps all holiday season long. Low calorie, low carb, low fat, and high protein, covered in 100% real chocolate. Built is a great option for when you're hungry. If Thanksgiving isn't coming soon enough, maybe go for a Built Bar or two to get you there. Maybe you get a little tired of the leftovers. Maybe your family is one that goes a little overboard and you want something else to get you through the day. Built Bar is there for that as well. They'll also have new surprises all month, limited time flavors arriving at built.com regularly. So check the site often. I believe right now they still have a little bit of the pumpkin puff. They did have last year, a ton of white chocolate options around the holiday or once it gets closer to winter. So definitely be checking back, definitely be filling your orders. And there's nothing like a Built Bar Black Friday. So mark your calendar. Black Friday will be a huge event at Built.com with all sorts of surprises. Again, that's Built.com. You're going to use the promo code LOCKED15 when you make your first or next order to get 15% off. Again, that's using the promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at Built.com. Okay, Katie. So right heading into the break, you finished my sentence, and I appreciate it because you were right. It's a dumb way to be framing this. I think it's dumb to call out Earl Watson directly as a not credible source. I think it's dumb on the Suns' part to categorically deny things that multiple people have said are true. If an NBA investigation plays out, you would imagine that many of the same people that Baxter Holmes spoke with would speak to the NBA, and they would be able to verify that these things happened. And if you start to mount up the number of people that Baxter says said these things, it's incredibly hard to, even if it is he said, or whatever it might be, there's a lot more he's on one side of this thing than there are on the other. And to say that it doesn't fit into a narrative, to me, I mean, it's the same thing we hear on the internet every single day by celebrities every single day. I mean, it's Robert Sarver using the cancel culture card, right? It's him saying that to be held accountable for things that I did that happen to be similar to things that other people have been accused of doing is somehow wrong innately because it happens to be a pattern that the media has been able to uncover. I don't get why you would frame it that way. And it comes across as, I mean, far be it for me to care about his legal strategy in a potential investigation. It doesn't seem like it's going to hold up, but it also just seems like a peculiar way to sort of uphold your own image and the image of the franchise you own.
Yeah, and I also think it's fairly indicative of how imperfect these investigations are and can be, but like by nature, they kind of have to be. And I think a lot of the parties involved are pretty uncomfortable with things getting uncomfortable and messy because it's new territory, right? So this idea of like trying to park all these allegations in some distant past where they shed relevancy because maybe they weren't brought up at the time, but then you have to look at like the catalyst for why they were brought up now. There's a reason, right? Where you have like this wellspring of voices kind of coming to a head because there's momentum now, like in the time that we live in. That's just the fact,
Yeah.
right? So I think it is interesting to try and like frame this around a narrative thing because to me that's like, yeah, that's the reason why this is happening now. That's not
Yeah.
like that doesn't discredit it at all. But you like the kind of the situation, especially in situations like this where most allegations, I mean, I'm just speaking in terms of like, let's talk about like assault allegations or things like that. I think about like the women in the story, right? Like are so reluctant to come forward. And like what was so heartbreaking, but not at all surprising in that story was one of the comments about, when you get into this kind of line of work, there's a certain expectation that you steel yourself for these kinds of things to happen. I've been there before. Yes, that is a true and really depressing reality, or like some of the other allegations where, again, like we talked about earlier, what do these women or anyone in this story really stand to gain? Nothing. But I think there's power. There's power in like the number of voices that are in this story, which is again why I think it's completely stupid and really irrelevant to say that, oh, this is over like such a long stretch of time that Baxter Holmes is trying to like fit these voices into a narrative that he's kind of like writing backwards, where it's like this is just what reporting is, right? Like
Yeah.
you find a first thread, you follow it, it takes you to another one, and like so on and so on and so on. Like these things don't exist in a vacuum, and I think that's why like men like Sarver have probably gotten away with these kind of long because they create power vacuums, right? Like they create spaces where they're the only ones, maybe they've got a handful of other guys who agree with them in these kind of upper echelon rooms where these decisions get made, and they're working very hard to keep a lot of other people out of those spaces. So the narrative stuff, like I don't really like in general how narrative has become a bad word, right? In
Yeah.
like sports media, because I think it's like a very, very generalized and oversimplified way at looking at what usually are very complicated problems.
No, you're totally right. Sorry, my dog is looking like he's about to bark. I'm trying to avoid the crisis, but I think you're totally right. I mean, I would the thing that I think about in listening to you and thinking about it myself is even in the day or two, we're talking on Saturday for everybody listening, we have already seen another investigation be launched in the NBA against
Mhm.
Neil Olshey. That
Mhm.
came down on late Friday night by Shams Charania of The Athletic for, as of now, very vague allegations, but similar in tone, toxic workplace, you know, things like that. So this narrative is not fake. It is very demonstrably true.
Yeah.
And you can look at John Gruden, and that was something that I was thinking of when we were talking in the last segment about sort of the response, and or Steve Kerr, people like this. You saw with that situation, a guy like Tony Dungy go on national TV, a former colleague of his, a black man, and that got a lot of attention because of his race. But most importantly, a colleague of his stand up and say, this doesn't fit the character and everything else. And yet John Gruden gets fired because there's evidence that these things happened. And so it just feels like this pattern continues to play out of allegation, denial, somebody comes to stand up for you. It plays out that you actually did these things, and then you get held accountable for it. It feels like we're headed towards some version of that with this. But I would also say, in terms of the sort of context that we're talking about too, and this idea of working backwards, or I'm sure there's some fans feeling, because of the way that I'm sure they're feeling let down by the fact that as a fan they were able to root for this incredible moment this summer, and then they were right back to this. And I talked about that a little bit on my show. That's kind of how I titled the episode, is like, this team, as long as Sarver is around, can't get away from it. It is the culture of the team. And I would say within that, there's probably a level within the voices of the people who spoke out for this story of seeing that success and feeling like they want to, like, that probably made them feel like they should go talk more often. We hear a lot of victims
Mhm.
talk about that, where it's like these people who are being championed and are on getting exposure and getting celebrated, it makes them feel disgusting inside that this person who they know to be much worse than the content of the character being broadcast to millions is being broadcast that way. And that inspires them to maybe share a story that they might not have otherwise. I'm not speaking for everybody who was a source for Baxter, but we do hear that as a pattern within this as well. If we're talking about this narrative, that's part of how it comes about, why, successful people are brought down, if we want to use the language that is deployed by them. It just frustrates me to hear it framed that way. And it was disappointing that even people aside from Sarver glommed on to the same type of language in their defense of him and attacking Baxter Holmes and Earl Watson. It just doesn't come across as innocence when you deny something in that way, but it also is just, it's grotesque. What else is, as we close down here, what else is sticking out to you, and maybe something we haven't talked about? There's so many layers to this thing. I don't want to leave anything out if it's on your mind.
Yeah, I think something that's very interesting to me within this is what people consider the metrics of success to be. Like in the case of Sarver, he's a billionaire, so you're obviously equating monetary value and worth with his, success and like his. It's okay. I have two dogs too, and they're being very chill now for some reason. They usually aren't. Um, but yeah, like this idea that, oh, he's a billionaire. And I think that's what threatens and makes nervous a lot of people that, are coming out to defend them, because they think like, oh, if this guy who's like so ensconced with his like wealth and privilege can be targeted, like maybe I could be targeted for the exact same things too. I mean, that's just like, yeah, that's the domino effect. And I don't have any qualms with that. I think like that's something that was bound to happen and has been like a due reckoning for some time, right? And like is going to keep happening. But I also think that, like, to touch on something I read in Kelly Dwyer's newsletter today, which phenomenal NBA writer. If you don't follow him, like you can find him on Substack, The Second Arrangement. But Kelly made like a very simple but true point, which is like, just get another billionaire in there. Like they're not difficult to find. Most of them have like same personality traits and like
Sure.
values that Sarver does. but you can probably find one that's like slightly less shitty, perhaps, to fill that void. Anyway, and I did want to say that I think a silver lining to the point you made about equating, yes, I agree with you. I think the success that the team had probably did drive a lot of people to want to speak out, because but to me that says more about the fact that you have people that are really involved in it now and don't want to walk away. They want to stay there. They want to stay as involved. They want to see the team get back to kind of the upper reaches that it reached last season, but they're working to change the culture internally. Then they actually care. I think that says more than if you had like these 70 people, some of which have walked away because they were like, this wasn't a healthy environment. And I felt like extremely threatened and depressed to be there. But some people refuse to walk away and instead are speaking out about it because they want to try and enact change. I think that's a very good and positive silver lining that like shouldn't be diminished in all of this. Because again, I think there's this sense when it's like, again, you made it was very funny, but it's like mostly in the story, he said, but like, if you want to say the power imbalance of like the smaller few to like this one larger figure, everybody, sorry, I lost my train of thought. Everyone,
You're totally good. No,
everybody.
I think,
So I was just going to say, yeah, that these people speaking out and wanting to change and maybe oust him doesn't say anything about them wanting to like tarnish or take away from what the team has achieved or what they have achieved. I think it's just this sense of like, well, we want to keep achieving things, but we don't want to do it under the yoke of somebody who seems to be holding everything over us, because then those people aren't really in positions to thrive or just like do the same good work they kind of want to do. And I think like, the Olshey story that you mentioned, it's not a surprise. And like the Sarver thing, like, I don't know, I'm very surprised by people that are surprised when these kinds of stories come out against, like, about whether they're, billionaire owners, or again, people in these kinds of positions being either just like outright heinous and terrible, or just like not good people. Like that is not surprising to me, because most of these people have gotten to live without consequence for such a long time in their lives, that is the way that they navigate the world. And this is the first time you're maybe seeing consequence come down on them. And I think their reactions to that consequence of being uncomfortable for maybe like a minute in the grand scheme of things is very, very indicative to me. And like more support behind the voices that are coming out and saying these people did these things. Because if you were able to kind of reconcile and reckon with the terrible things that you've done, you'd be a little bit kind of cowed by them, or maybe a little bit embarrassed. But like Sarver does not seem embarrassed to me. He seems like someone who's used to denying things outright and being used to that being like all he needs to say for problems to go away.
And I think Suns fans are finding hope in this Jamna Jaffe character. He's somebody who's partnered with Colin Kaepernick. He set aside his own money to invest in some of the league's efforts with anti-racism last year. I don't know really who this gentleman is. I don't know if he would be a better owner. I have no reason to think he would do the things that Robert Sarver is alleged of, but I think you're right to, again, say that these people fit this pattern that we're talking about for a reason as well. And it's that lack of accountability. But I would also, we get very quickly to like larger cultural conversations because this is happening in so many fields. But the idea of what accountability even looks like for those people, there's a version of this that ends with Robert Sarver selling the team willingly, making billions of dollars off of doing so, and getting to continue to run his bank, getting to continue to have his various forms of wealth. Nothing will go away. This is not a person who will, have sponsorship deals cut or some of the other ways that maybe an athlete might lose forms of income. He can't be cut from owning the team. I mean, maybe they're way down the line could be an ouster. I doubt we're anywhere close to that. So accountability in this case is to make a bunch of money and maybe get your name tarnished a little bit and then move on with your life. The negative outcome for the people who spoke up was, in some cases, suicidal thoughts. In some cases, permanent trauma, loss of a job. Maybe you left the profession. Maybe you weren't able to find another job because you left your previous one unceremoniously. And those are people who make far less money than Robert Sarver, have far less comfortable lives, and in a lot of cases are already in society people who are marginalized for other reasons. So it I don't, not that I think many people listening to this are going to be sort of sad for Sarver, but when you hear him speak about the way that he's being harmed by any of this, I think we should just keep in mind what that harm even looks like, and the I guess take it with a grain of salt. But we do have to wrap up. The story's not going anywhere. I hope we can have Katie back on. Thank you for joining us. You can read her at her newsletter, Basketball Feelings. You can listen to her at Dishes and Dimes, the podcast, Basketball, the podcast, and read her as well at Dime Up Rocks. Katie, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me.